Hello everyone, welcome to today's video tutorial. In today's video, we are going to make use of Angular 17 as well as Supabase to create a real-time chat application. Now let's take a quick look at the demo of today's project. As you can see on the page, we have a button that says sign up using Google. What this button does actually is it makes use of the authentication service in Supabase as well as Google Oauth 2.0 service to create the authentication. Currently, we have no users on the Supabase dashboard, as you can see. Another thing you should take note of is we have two tables in our Supabase setup. The first one is the users table and the second one is the chat table. As you can see, both of these tables are empty. What this user tables does is basically anytime a new user signs into the project, not only do they get saved in the authentication page we see right here, but they also get saved in the users table. So we make use of this by making use of Supabase functions and Supabase triggers. We'll get to look into that as the tutorial proceeds. But for now, let's take a sample of how the integration for the authentication works. So I'm going to head back to the Angular project. I'm going to click on the sign up using Google button and then a new page pops up. This page asks us to choose an account we want to sign up into the chat dashboard. So I'm going to select the first email on the browser here, and then as you can see, I get authorized and signed into the chat dashboard. But before I show how this chat dashboard works, I would like to head back to the Supabase dashboard, and as you can see on the users table, we have some details showing, which includes the user's ID, the user's full name, as well as the user's avatar URL. We are able to retrieve all this data from the newly signed in user and then save it into our users table. With that, we'll be able to use it on the front end of our application anytime the user sends a message. What do I mean by this? If I head back to the dashboard and I type in a message, this is a test, and I click on send, you can see we have the username, which is Deji Adeshoga, which you can see right here, the user's avatar image, which you can see right here, and then the user's ID, which we do not need to render into the user interface, but we also have access to the date and as well as the time the user sends the message, which you can see here. Another feature of this application is anytime we send the message in the chat table, it gets fetched in real time without needing to refresh the page in our Angular application. Let's try to send another message to see how this works. So back in the chat application, let's send a new message that says this is a test 2 and then click on send. As you can see, the message gets displayed in real time in our Angular project as well as on the Supabase dashboard, which you can see right here. So this chat table has a field of ID created at text, editable, as well as the sender ID. So we display some of these details on the page. Another feature of this project is as a user, you are able to delete your message. So if you click on this menu right here and you click on this delete drop down, a modal pops up in front of you and you are presented with two prompts: to proceed with deletion of your message or to change your mind if you do no longer want to delete your message. So let's proceed to delete this message. So I'm going to click on yes, and then the message gets deleted while the page gets programmatically refreshed without reloading the entire Angular application. We make use of this by making use of the router feature in Angular 17. Also, a user can get to log out from this chat dashboard by simply clicking on the logout button, and then they get navigated back to the login page. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sign up again using a brand new user. Let's see if the details is going to be different from our previous user. So let me click on another account and then send a message using this account that says this is a new test. So I'm going to click on send, and as you can see, this user has a different avatar image as well as a different name, and then this user can delete their own message. If they try to delete another person's message, it's not going to work. A user can only delete their own message. If you try to do this, if I click on the menu and I click on delete, you can see the message does not get deleted, but the user can proceed to delete their own message, as you can see right there. So that's all for this tutorial. But before we proceed, I would like to highlight some very important concepts you stand to gain if you decide to follow along with this project. So in this tutorial, you are going to learn how to authenticate an Angular application by making use of Supabase and Google's Oauth 2.0. You're also going to learn how to integrate functional route guard for route protection. That is, if a user is not currently logged in, they cannot access the dashboard. The route guard is going to prevent them and log them back to the login screen. So we're going to make use of the newly integrated functional route guard in Angular 17 to make use of this feature. Another thing you are going to learn is how to work with the latest control flows in Angular. That is, we have the new control flows which include the @if and @else block. In Angular 17, the syntax to these directives were changed and updated. Another thing you're going to learn is how to manage states using signals. Signals was newly introduced in Angular 16 and fully functional in Angular 17. So in this tutorial, you're going to learn how to manage the data in the application by making use of signals. So if you are learning Angular and you've not touched signal before, this tutorial is a good place to start to learn how to make use of signals. Also, you learn how to create tables in Supabase. Supabase makes use of PostgreSQL. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to integrate the tables by making use of some of the keywords required to create tables in Supabase. Another thing you are going to learn is how to set up security policies for created tables. So as you are setting up your table in Supabase, you have options of creating security policies, that is to determine who has access to what in the database. Another thing I'm going to learn is how to create Supabase functions and trigger events. And finally, you learn how to use Angular to delete, list, and insert data into the Supabase table in real time. So you have a lot to learn in this tutorial, and I think with that we can get started with this project. To get started with this project, we are going to head straight to GitHub, and in GitHub we are going to clone a boilerplate template for the UI design. The link to this particular GitHub repo is going to be in the description box on YouTube to help you get started with this project. To do that, all we need to do is to click on this code button. It brings out a drop down, and then we're going to click on this copy to clipboard icon. Now, all we need to do is to head straight to the terminal where you want to create your project, and then run the command git clone and then the URL you copied from GitHub. So what that does is it's going to clone the project into your project directory. So once that is done, you need to cd into the project directory, which is ng-charts-ui, and then click on enter. But before we proceed, we need to have access to all the dev dependencies, and to do that we need to run npm install. So quickly, I'm going to run npm install, and then it's going to download all the packages in our dev dependencies within our package.json file. Now that the installation is complete, we can now open the project directly in our Visual Studio Code editor. So I'm going to run code and then dots and press enter. So it's going to open the project up in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to increase the fonts so it's more clear for you to see the code. So the next step is to head straight to the src directory. This is where Angular has all the required folders needed to run the Angular application. So I'm going to extend it further by heading straight to the app directory. And within the app directory, we have a pages directory where we have two components. We have the chat component as well as the login component. So what I'm going to do is to open up the chat component, and you can see the user interface code. So all the code here are all static code, and we have a CSS to do a bit of styling. So there's nothing strange here. This is just the user interface for the project. The reason why I'm not creating the user interface from scratch is so that we can focus fully on the integration of our chat application instead of focusing on the user interface. Now, another thing you should take note of is in the index.html file, we have the Bootstrap 5 CDN available for us. As you can see, this is the CDN link that make reference to Bootstrap 5 as well as the scripts for the Bootstrap 5 CDN. What this does is it allows us to have access to the classes. Some of the classes you can see here in the user interface. Same thing was applied to the login components. Within the login components, we have the HTML code as well as the CSS code to help us integrate the design, which I think is very easy to understand, so there's no need for me to go into details with that. So to test how the UI currently looks, I'm going to scroll down and head straight to the app components.html file. And within this file, you can see we have the app login and the app chat currently imported or referenced here. And one feature you should know is in previous versions of Angular, you don't have self-closing tags. So Angular recently created this update, so where you can make use of self-closing tags, which I think it's a very good development from the Angular team. Also, another thing you should take note of is in the app component.ts file, because we are dealing with standalone components, which is also one of the new features in Angular, we need to import each component we reference in our templates. For instance, we are trying to reference the app login and the app chat. That means we need to import them within the imports array, which we have right here. Now that that is clarified, what I'm going to try to do is to compile the code, and then let's see how it displays on the browser. So to do that, I'm going to make use of the traditional ng serve command. So I'm going to press enter, and then the compilation begins. As you can see, our compilation is successful, and in Angular 17, some analysis are available in the terminal that shows the sizes of your Angular application, the initial load size, and the time it requires to complete the compilation. So this is the local host URL, which is localhost 4200. So I'm going to head to that route in the browser. So to do that, all I need to do is to type in localhost 4200, and as you can see, we have this button that does nothing currently because we just have a UI. So if I click on this button, nothing happens. So we can see the login button or the login page is just the user interface currently available. Now let's see how the chat component looks. To do that, all I need to do is just to comment out the login tag and then uncomment the chat tag. So all I need to do is save, and then once the project compiles, we head straight to the browser. As you can see, we have the chat user interface. So nothing happens. I can click on send, type in, click on logout, nothing is happening. So we need to configure everything from scratch, and then so we need to configure everything from scratch. So I'm going to show you how to do it step by step with no step skipped. So the next thing I want us to do is to deal with Supabase. So to do that, I'm going to run npm install for Supabase. So once again, I'm going to stop the terminal, and then I'm going to call npm install at supabase/supabase-js. So this is the command for you to install Supabase in your project. So we're going to wait for the installation to be complete, and once that is done, we can move to the next step. As you can see, the installation is complete and Supabase has been installed into this project. To confirm, I'm going to head straight to the package.json file. As you can see, this M means modified. That is a change has occurred in this file, and when we scroll down a little bit, we can see we have at supabase/supabase-js, and it shows the version, which is currently version 2.42.5. That is the current version as far as this tutorial is concerned. In the future, you might be following along this tutorial and you might be seeing a new version, probably version 3 or version 4 or version 5, depending on the year you decide to follow or go through this tutorial. So some slight changes might have occurred during that time, but for now, with version 2.42.5, which is the latest version, we can now continue our integration. So the next thing I want to do before we proceed is to generate our environment variable file. To do that, we need to run the command ng generate environment. So what this folder does basically is to help us create a place where we can store our API key. Any API key we get from Supabase, this is the place to do it. So if I go back to the project, you can see we have this environment folder, and this environment.development for when you want to save the API key currently in the development mode, and if you want to go live, you can make use of the environment.cs file. So depending on what you want to do, but for this project, since we are still in development mode, the API key is going to be configured in the development file, environments.development file. So with that, we can move on to the next step, which is to look at the authentication service in Supabase. So let's head straight to Supabase. So now that we are inside of the Supabase dashboard and I'm signed into my account, if you don't have a Supabase account, all you need to do is to go to supabase.com and then use your GitHub account to authenticate yourself into the Supabase dashboard. Now you can see I currently have two projects called ng gallery and ng super-auth. I think I've used these projects in the past to create Angular tutorials, but for the sake of this tutorial, I want to create everything from scratch, so I won't use any of these predefined projects in Supabase. What I'm going to do is to create a new project. So within this organization, I'm going to click on the new project button and then choose the organization which I currently have, which is the Sugar 10 org. So once I click on that, we are presented with a new form. So we need to fill the form. So the project name is going to be called ngchats. And then the password, I'm going to generate the password dynamically by making use of a browser extension called Bitwarden. So I'm going to click on generate password and I'm going to type in the password, and Supabase considers the password as strong. And then I'm going to select a region. For best results, like that is in order to reduce latency, you need to select a server that is closest to your location. So for me, I think I'm going to go with an European location, which is pre-selected for me. I'm going to go with Frankfurt. So as you can see, you have this text here that says select the region closest to your users for best performance. So that's a very important criteria. So I'm going to click on create new project. So the project is going to get configured for us, and with that we can now create our authentication. As you can see, the setting of the project is now complete, and we get presented with a welcome to your new project message, and the project status is showing this yellow icon right here. So but what we need to do actually is just to hover over the sidebar we have right here and head straight to authentication, because we want to authenticate our project. And once you're in the authentication tab, all you need to do is to click on providers, and under providers you have so many providers. I think in this YouTube channel I've gone over so many of these providers, and today I'm going to try a new one, which is Google. So I'm going to click on Google and I'm going to enable sign in with Google. So the signing with Google requires two input fields to be filled up. That is the client ID for the Oauth service as well as the client's secret for the Oauth service. So we need to get these two requirements from a platform called Google Cloud Platform. So if you are not familiar with Google Cloud Platform, if you have a Google account, you can always create a new project in the Google Cloud Platform and then derive the client ID as well as the client secret, which is what we are going to do next. So you don't have to worry about it. I'm going to show you how to do it in a simple step. So let's head to GCP and see how we can get our client ID as well as our client's secret. So inside of GCP, as you can see, I already signed in, and if you are not signed in, once you go to console.cloud.google.com, you are going to have a page where you can log in using your Google account. Once you sign in, you'll be required to create a project. For me, I have some projects currently available. As you can see, I have about 7 or so projects, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to start everything from scratch. So I'm going to create a new project in GCP so that you can follow along and see how to get the client ID as well as the client's secret. So let's click on new project, and then we get presented with a new field that says project name as well as the project organization. So the project name I'm going to call ngchats, and then I currently don't have any organization I can select, but if you have an organization, you can always browse through the organization and then select them. But for me, I don't have any organization, so all I need to do is just to click on create. As you can see, the project is getting created for us through this loading icon. So it's going to take probably before I finish speaking, the project has just been created. So we need to select the project because the current project selected is called Angu. We need to select ngchat. So to do that, we click on this drop down right there and then click on ngchat. So once ngchat is selected, we can now proceed. And to proceed, we need to head to APIs and services. You can see it's here, but another place where you can locate the API and services, in case it's not showing in this quick access section of the browser, I'm going to close this message. You can click on this menu icon, this navigation menu icon, and then it's going to extend the sidebar. And as you can see, you have API services. So under the API services, what you need to do is to click on credentials. So I'm going to click on credentials, and it's going to take us to the credentials page. Under the credentials page, we need to create credentials, and to do that, we need to click on this create credentials button above. So I'm going to click on that, and what I'm going to select is the Oauth client ID, which is what we need. in our Supabase dashboard. So I'm going to click on that and it's going to take us to the page. And within the page, there's a requirement for you to create a client ID. You must first configure your consent screen. So for us, we currently have a brand new project and we've never configured the consent screen before. So we need to do that for us to have access to the client ID. So all I need to do is to click on this configure consent screen. So this screen is going to load out a new page and we have two options. That is for the user types. We have the internal and the external. So the internal is just available for users within your organization. No need to submit your app for verification. While for external users, you need to submit your app for testing mode and things like that. But for us, we are just working on a educational content. So we are going to select internal radio button. So we have a warning button which doesn't allow me to click on the internal radio button because it says you are not a Google Workspace user. All right, fine. I'm not a Google Workspace user. So let's just go with the external anyways and then click on create. So you can see we have some forms we need to fill. So let's start from the beginning. The app name. So the app name for the consent screen, I'm going to stay consistent and go with ngchat. And then support email, I'm going to select my email, thecodeangle@gmail.com. For the logo, I'm just going to leave that blank for now. Next up, it's asking for the application homepage. That is the link to the project's homepage. This is going to be in localhost because we're still trying to create the app in development. So we only have the localhost URL. So I'm just going to paste in localhost 4200 within the application homepage, which is our current homepage. Provide users with a link to your public policy. I don't have a public policy. Terms of service, we don't have links for that. So we're going to scroll down and then developer contacts email address. It's also the code angle. So I'm just going to enter the code angle@gmail.com and then I can click on save and continue. Then under the scopes, we don't have any scope. I'm going to click on save and continue. And then for the test users, currently I don't have any users I want to add, but let's click on this add users and see. Okay, you can add as much as 100 users to test your application, but for this application, this is mainly for educational content, so we don't need to add any tester. So I'm going to click on save and continue, and finally it shows us a summary of all the forms we've filled. And then if we want to make any edits, we can always go back, but I think we're good to go. So I'm going to click on back to dashboard. Now that we are back to dashboard, I'm going to head back to the credentials. We have now, as you can see, we've now set up our Oauth consent screen. So I'm going to head back to credentials, and under credentials, I'm going to click on create credentials once more, and then the Oauth client ID, which is for the second time. So now you see we get presented with a new form instead of the notification being that we should create a consent screen. We've created our consent screen. Now it's asking us for application type. So let's click on the drop down. Our application type is actually a web application. It isn't an Android app or a Google Chrome extension. So I'm going to select web application. And like I said, I will stay consistent with the name and I'm going to call it ngchat once again. So with that, we can now click on create to create our client Oauth ID. So it says note, it may take 5 minutes to a few hours for settings to take effect. For the sake of God, let's hope this doesn't take more than 5 minutes. All right, I'm going to click on the create button. And as you can see, we have our client ID as well as our client secret created for us. And then we can download it as JSON, and we can also see that the status is set as enabled, and luckily for us, the client ID was created in less than 10 seconds. Now all we need to do is just to copy these values into our Supabase dashboard. So I'm going to start with the client ID. So I'm going to grab the client ID, head straight to Supabase, paste it within the Supabase dashboard, and then head back to the GCP, click on the client secrets, and then paste it within the client secrets Oauth. And then back in the GCP, I'm going to click on OK. So there's this condition here that says callback URL for Oauth. I think we need to include this in our Google Cloud platform so that it can always reference this Supabase application. So I'm going to copy it, and I think we forgot to set it up while we were trying to create our credential. So to do that, I'm going to edit our ng chart what, and I'm going to add the redirect URI, which is here. So under the redirect URI, I'm going to paste it. I'm going to paste in what was given to us in Supabase. You can see this is the callback when using the Oauth signing with Google for web. So it's our callback URL. We need to provide it under the authorized redirect URL. So I think we're good to go with that. We can now click on save, and I think that's all we need to do under the Google Cloud platform. Now, before we round up this portion of the tutorial, do not forget to click on save for our enable signing with Google to be completed. Now that it's successfully saved, we can now head back to our Visual Studio Code to integrate our authentication service. To do that, what I'd like to do first is to configure the Angular router. So I'm going to scroll down to app.routes.cs file, and within this file, I'm going to close the rest of the open tabs which we don't need. So within the app.routes.cs file, you can see we have a route array, and within this route array, we're going to create the route object. Now this is going to be a functional route, which is the latest syntax in Angular 17. So let's open the first object, and within the first object, we're going to set the path, and the path to this is going to be charts, which is our charts dashboard. And then we can now make use of the load components to import the components for this path. So I'm going to type in load component, and we have a parenthesis, a fat arrow, and then we're going to call import. And within the parenthesis, we're going to reference the import page by doing /pages/charts/charts.components, and then because it returns a promise, we're going to make use of .then, and then passing an argument of com, and then the com represents the component. So I'm going to say components dot, we're going to call the chart component. So I'm going to say chart component. So that's all we need to do to create the first route object for the charts component. So I'm going to duplicate this. So the second component, which is the last component we have, is the login component. So all I need to do is just to type in login. I didn't spell login correctly. And once I type in login, I can just replace charts with login, and then the component with login component. So that's what we need to do. So in case the user wants to pass in an empty path, we can undo that as well. So I'm going to duplicate this, and all I need to do is just to remove the login path, which we have right there. So I'm going to save. So anytime the user doesn't enter a /, that is, if they enter a empty path, they get navigated to the login component. So with that, we can now head straight to the integration of our login and logout function. So quickly, we need to generate a service to do that. So I'm going to head straight to the terminal, and then I'm going to run the command ng generate service. The S represents service. So under the service, I'm going to generate the service within a services folder, and I'm going to do /auth. This is where our auth service is going to live in, within a services folder. As you can see, the auth service folder has been generated for us. So let's head back to the project, and then let's locate the auth service, which is right here. The first thing I want to do is to create an instance of the Supabase client. To do that, we need to configure the Supabase URL as well as the Supabase key within our environment variable. So we need to head back to the Supabase dashboard, and then head straight to project settings, and within the project settings, click on API, which is under configuration, and then we need to grab the Supabase URL. So I think we can find the URL somewhere here at the top of the page. As you can see, project URL. So I'm going to grab the project URL, head straight to the project, and within the environment.development.ts file, I'm going to set production to false, and then I'm going to call Supabase URL. I'm going to set that to the Supabase URL we copied just now from Supabase. And then the second one is going to be the Supabase key. So all we need to do is just to say Supabase key, and then we need to grab the key as well. So within the dashboard, so the key, we have two types of key. We have the unknown public key and the service role secret. So for the sake of this project, because we are going to have role level security enabled for our tables, so this is the right key for us. So I'm going to grab that and then paste it within the Supabase key object. So I'm going to save, and then we can now use this Supabase object within our auth service while creating the Supabase instance. So quickly within the constructor, in fact, before we do it within the constructor, I'm going to create a variable called Supabase and inject the Supabase client into it. So what I mean is we're going to type in private Supabase. We make use of private because this variable is only needed within this file. So Supabase, and then we can just give it a type of Supabase client, which we need to inject, and you can see it's injected right there at the top, and it gives an error that says Supabase is declared but its value is never read, and also property Supabase has no initializer. So to get rid of this, you can either make use of an exclamation mark or a question mark. Any of these two works, but I'm going to use the exclamation mark. That's the convention I am comfortable with. So we can now head straight to the constructor to configure our Supabase client. So to do that, I'm going to say this.supabase is equals to create client, which we also need to import. As you can see above, we have the create client imported. I'm going to open a parenthesis, and within the parenthesis, we need to configure our environment Supabase URL and our environment Supabase key. So to do that, I'm going to do environment, which we need to import as well. So we have imported environment from development file. So I'm going to say environment dot. So it gives us the option of the Supabase key and the Supabase URL. But the first one we need is the Supabase URL. So I'm going to call that, and then finally we can now call the environment dot Supabase key. So that's all we need to do to configure the Supabase client. We can now make use of this instance called Supabase anywhere within our project to access the various methods available for us to configure our logged in, to enable us also to sign out from the application. So the first thing I want to do is to make use of the Supabase on auth state changed. So to know the meaning of the on auth state change in Supabase, I'm going to head to the browser and type in on auth states change in Supabase. As you can see, this method allows us to listen to auth events. I'm going to open up this particular link to get more insight on what it means. As you can see, it enables us to listen to auth events, that is authentication in events. So that is, you can see the highlights below. It allows us to subscribe to important events occurring on the user session. But one important thing about this particular event is it emits 3 events. The first one is the initial session, the signed in session, and the signed out session. So what it does basically is it allows us to track the current state of the user. That is, if the user is either signed in or signed out. So we need to always know this to determine how we are going to render the user sessions in our project. So I'm going to head back to the browser and let you see what I mean. So within the constructor, we can just say this.supabase.auth.onAuth state change, which we can see right here. And then it's going to take a parenthesis, and then it's going to take in 2 arguments. The first one is called event, and the second one is called session. So I'm going to make use of a fat arrow and then open a bracket. And what I'm going to do next is to console log each of these arguments. So the first one is the event. I'm going to type in event, and then under the second console log, I'm going to type in session and this session. So to see this in action, what I'm going to do is to save. I think we should be able to get the instance of this event once we save. So I'm going to save and then type in ngserve, and then let's see if we get anything console logged in the browser. Quickly we head back to the browser, and then I'm going to open up the inspect button and then head straight to the console. Now, as you can see, we don't get to see anything within the console. Now, the reason for this is because this particular service is not being called by any of our components. But once we reference this service in any of our components, that is our login components, this is where we need to make use of the authentication service. We're going to see these console logged events in the browser. So what I'm going to do is to create the sign in with Google Oauth service. So below the constructor, I'm going to say a sync, and then I'm going to call it sign in with Google, and it doesn't take in any argument. So I'm just going to open the bracket, and within the bracket, we're going to await this .supabase.auth. Then we can see the various methods available to us. Well, what we need to do is to sign in with auth. So I'm going to say sign in with Oauth, and the sign in with Oauth takes in a parenthesis and an object, and within this we have some conditions we need to set. The first one is the provider. We have other options, but for this tutorial, we're going to only make use of the provider to signify the type of provider we are trying to work with, which is, as you can see from the Supabase dashboard, it's Google. So if you are working with any other one, maybe like the Apple or GitHub, you need to reference it there right here to show the type of what service you are working with. So we are working with Google currently. So before I proceed, I would like to create the sign out method as well. So I can just say a sync sign out. Let's give the O an uppercase and then open a bracket. The sign out doesn't also take in any argument. So all we need to do is just to await the response. And by saying this.supabase.what, then the sign out method available for us in Supabase. What this method will do is to clear the entire local storage and possibly the session storage in the browser when a user tries to log out. So now let's try to call these methods within our login component. So I'm going to head straight to the login component, and within the login component, we need to inject our auth service. So to do that, we're going to make use of the injector, which is one of the new updates available for us in Angular. Instead of making use of the constructors, we can just say private auth is equals to inject, and then we're going to call the auth service, which, as you can see, is imported for us above. We also need to inject the injector within our components within Angular core. So I'm going to click on the inject, and then we can just inject it within Angular core, which you can see right here. So now we have a reference to the instance of the auth service. So now let's create the method to undo our authentication. So I'm going to say a sync, and within a sync, I'm going to say handle auth. Let's call our method handle auth, and then we can now say const response is equals to await. Let's reference our auth service by saying this.auth dot. We have two options currently: sign in with Google or sign out. Okay, it's called sign in Google. Let me check. I'll prefer it to be called sign in with Google. So I'm just gonna grab this and then paste it within our login component, and then add the parenthesis at the end. So with this, we can have access to signing in with Google. Now we need to undo this using the click events in our template. So to do that, let's head to the HTML file of our login component, and we're gonna call it, I'm gonna change this a tag to button. So we don't have the href, we don't need the href. So this is gonna be a button. And then, okay, let me change the syntax. The button should be below. So within the button, let's make use of our click event handler in Angular. So I'm just going to call click, which is equals to handle auth. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far and then head back to the browser. So for this, I'm going to refresh the components, and then I'm going to try to reference the login component within our app components for now, because we've not integrated the auth guard. So for now, I'm going to load the login component so we can test out our Google login method. So now we have sign up using Google. So I'm going to click on sign up using Google, and let's see the response we get. As you can see, it asks us to choose the particular Google account we want. I'll clear the console before I click on one. Let's select done to stay at gmail.com, and it's going to ask us if we want to continue. I'm going to click on continue, and then our request is successful. As you can see, our request is successful. And if you can look at the console, for now we are not routing to the dashboard on successful response. For now, I want us to take a look at the console.log we did in our service. So I'm going to close this and this as well. In our auth service, we are console logging the event as well as the session. So let's take a look. So you can see the session as an object, while the event showed sign in. That is, this user is currently signed in. So with this session, it shows an object of the user's detail, like the email, the date it was created, the role which is currently authenticated, and other details which you might consider important. It also shows the refresh token as well as the provider token and the access token. So you can handle all these responses to configure your application while you are authenticating your user. So what we want to do next is to create the authentication guard. That is, when the user is signed in, they get logged into the chat component, but if they are not logged in, they get shown on the current page, which is the sign up component. So let's integrate the auth guard. And to integrate the auth guard, we need to create a guard. So I'm going to stop the terminal once again, and I'm going to run ng generate guard, and then the guard is going to be called auth because it's, oh, I made a mistake. I didn't put a G, I didn't put generate. It's supposed to be ng generate guard, then the auth guard, which is the name of the guard. So it's going to generate a new auth guard file for us. So it presents us with some prompts if we want to create it using the CanActivate, the CanActivate child, the can deactivate, and the can match. But the one we need is the CanActivate auth guard. So I'm going to select CanActivate, and as you can see, it's the two files required, the test file and the auth guard file itself gets generated. So we're going to head straight to Visual Studio Code, and let's take a look at the auth guard file. I'm going to close the app routes as well as the login component.ts. So you can see this is a functional guard. In previous versions of Angular, I think from Angular 15 downwards, we still make use of class-based auth guard, but for Angular 16 and above, the functional guard was introduced. So if you have not used the auth guard, so this tutorial is going to explain to you step by step how to use the functional auth guards to configure your Angular applications authentication states. Now, before we begin our integration here, we still need to do some things in our auth service file. So one of those things is to get the login state of the user. So to get the login state of the user, we're going to make use of the session. This session we need to set it to local storage. Once we save it in local storage, then we get a way to persist or to determine whether our user is currently logged in or not. This particular data is important while configuring our auth guard. So to do that, below the console logs, I'm just going to say local storage. Remember, we're within the auth state change. This is where we get to determine our auth events and our session events. So we can also say local storage dot set item because we are trying to save the session, and I'm going to call it session. And then I'm going to make use of json.stringify. So I'm going to say json.stringify, and I'm going to save the session. Now we need the user session because when you check the console log, the user session contains the information we need. So I'm just going to say session.user. So let's remove one of the brackets. So I'm going to say session.user. So that's all we need to do to save the item in local storage. So now we need to create a condition that if the user exists, then we want to navigate the user to the chat component. So to do that, I'm going to say if session.user. So if the session.user object exists, then I can say this router.navigate, and then we can make reference to the chat component by doing /chat. So we have this error. We need to inject the router by making use of the injector. So I can just say private router is equals to inject, and then we can call the router. So we need to import two things, the router as well as the inject service. So you can see the error disappears, and we can now proceed with our integration. So now we need to head to the auth guard service. So within the auth guard service, what we need to do is I'm going to leave the state as it is. So I'm going to say we need a particular getter function for us to determine the state of the application. So after saving this session in local storage, we also need a getter function, and this getter function is what we use in this auth guard. So let's quickly create a getter function. So below the constructor or outside the constructor, you can just say get. Anytime you click create a getter, you signify it by saying get. It's going to return a boolean actually. So I'm going to say get is logged in. That is, if the user is logged in, then I'm going to signify it as a boolean. Then we're going to have a bracket. So we're going to create a variable that says const user is equals to local storage. We need to get the item. So I'm going to say local storage dot get item. So what item are we trying to get? We're trying to get the session, and then we're going to save it as string, and then we now need to return the getter, because without the return we will always get an error that says an accessor must return a value. So that's one of the conditions of creating an accessor. So to return the value, we're going to say return, and then we're going to say user, which is the variable we created above. If the user is undefined, so if the user is undefined, we can return false. However, if the user is defined, we can return true. So this is the getter we're going to use in our auth guard to determine if the user is logged in or or not, because anytime the user session is available, it's going to return true. If it's the user session is not available, it's going to return false. So back to the auth guard, we can now say if we need to make use of the injector here too to reference our auth service. So I'm going to say inject, then I'm going to call the auth service, which has just been imported above. Let's import inject as well. So if the auth service dot, you can see the methods available for us. We have sign in with Google, we have sign out, then we have the getter, which is called is logged in. So if auth service dot is logged in is equals to false, so what do we want to do? We want to navigate the router to the login page. So to do that, we need to make use of inject again, and this time around the inject is going to deal with the router. We are going to bring in the router, which has just been imported above. So we're going to say inject router dot navigate, and then just like we did in our auth service file, I'm going to reference / login here, and then we need to return something. We need to return false. So if the login state is false, we'll navigate the user back to the login page. Else, we do what? We return true. So where the true comes in is where this router.navigate moves the user to the chat dashboard. So this is how the router works. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far, and then let's test it out. But to do that, we need to run our project once more by calling ng serve. While the project is compiling, I'm going to head straight to the Supabase service, and I'm going to delete the current user, because while we were creating the authentication, we created a new user, which is the don't to stay email. So I'm going to delete this particular user. So let's get this deleted, and then our project is still compiling. The delete is successful, so currently we have no users. Cool. So now our compilation is complete. The project gets refreshed, and we need to clear the local storage. So I'm going to clear the local storage, and this is so that we assume this is a new user coming into the application. I'm going to refresh the page. So now what I'm going to do is try to access the chat component. So I'm going to say / chat. As you can see, we get navigated back to the login page. So let's try for / chat once again. We get navigated to the login page. So now let's try to create a new user. So let's click on sign up using Google. Select the user we were using before, which is done to stay at gmail.com. And for some reason, it doesn't navigate us to the chat dashboard. Okay, let's investigate why that is the situation. Oh, I think we forgot to remove the configuration we did in the app.component.html file. We need to get rid of this. This is confusing our application. So we need to get rid of it and then remove it from the import array as well. So I'm going to get rid of this. We no longer need them to display the application. Now we can now save and then head back to the page. Yes, as you can see, we get navigated to the chat application because the user is signed in. Cool. So now let's integrate the logout button within the chat component. We already created the function in the service. So all we need to do is just to head straight to the chat component, and within the chat component, we can create the logout method. So I can just say async logout, and then we need to reference our auth service. So we need to make use of the injector to do that. So I'm going to say private auth is equals to inject and then auth service, which we need to import both. So let's import the inject. So we have the inject method imported. So we can now say this .auth dot, we have the sign out method. So it returns a promise. So we can just say .then and then make use of a fat arrow, and then we can just make use of the router by saying this .router dot navigate. We need to navigate back to the login page, and then if there is an error, so we can just say .catch, pass in the error argument, and then probably alert an error, and alert error .message. Cool. So we can still see we have the error. This .router has not been ejected. It doesn't exist. So we can just quickly say private router, like we've done so many times in this app, inject, and then call the router. That is all. So let's test out our logout if it works. So I'm going to clear the console, click on logout. Oh, we are nothing happens because we haven't made use of the click event handler. So quickly head straight to the HTML page. I completely forgot about that. So within the button, I'm going to make use of the click event handler. So we can just say click and then is equals to call the logout method and then save once again. So this should work now that we have the click event. So I'm going to click on log out, and you can see the user is logged out. I'm going to refresh the page, and then so let's try to access the charts URL without logging into the application. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to say /charts, and whoa, for some reason, despite the fact that we are not logged in, we're able to access the dashboard. This is not good. So to prevent this, there's one final thing we need to do with our auth guard. We need to call it within our router. So the applications we do not want, or the components we do not want anyone to access without logging in, we need to call the auth guard right there using CanActivate. So those components include the charts and the charts alone. Only logged in users should be able to access our charts component. So below the chart part, I'm going to call CanActivate, which needs to be imported into this component. So CanActivate, and I'm going to make use of a square bracket, and I'm going to call auth in lowercase auth guard. So we need to import our auth guard, which has been done above, and then we need to put a comma so it gets rid of the error. So I'm going to save, and then let's head back to the browser to test things out once more. In fact, we don't, because immediately the auth guard was injected into the router, it routes the user away from the dashboard because they are not currently logged in. Let's try to access the charts component once again from the URL. As you can see, our auth guard is in full control by navigating us back to the sign up or sign in with user button. So only signing users can access our dashboard. But there is one more thing I want us to do before we complete our authentication part of this tutorial. So I'm going to click on the sign up with Google once again, and then I'm going to select one of the Google accounts, which is the first one we have right here. And then as you can see, we get logged into the component, but there's a warning here that says navigation triggered outside Angular zone. Did you forget to call ngzone.run? Because it's within the Angular zone, we need to make use of ngzone to get rid of that error message. So quickly back to our service, where we have the router, I'm gonna say this._ngzone.run. The ngzone also needs to be injected into this component, so let's not forget that. But for now, I'll just move the router into the ngzone. Now let's inject ngzone into this component. So quickly above, below the router, you can just say private_ngzone is equals to inject. So we need to inject ngzone. So that gets rid of the error. So let's save, and then let's let the page reload. We can see that error gets disappeared. And even if we log out, let's log out and log in again to see if we get to see that error message. We can see it has completely disappeared. So we do not have the ngzone error. So we are good to go. So with that, we've been able to complete the authentication part of this tutorial. So next up is for us to start creating the tables for our chart application. So for this application, we're going to have two tables created in Supabase. Now, let's take a look at this readme.md file. So this readme.md file contains our database schema. So like I said, the link to this GitHub repository is going to be made available in the description box. So it contains everything you need to know to create a database table in Supabase. So the two tables we are going to create is, the first one is the users table, then the second one is the chat messages table. So these are the two tables we are going to be creating, and the two schemas include the ID, the full name, and then the avatar URL, while the chat table is going to contain the ID, the created art, the text, the editable, and then the sender, that is the sender UID. And then if the message is going to be editable or not, the text is the message being sent, and the date is the dates in which the message was sent, and the ID for that particular message. So let's get started with the users table. Now to create the users table, let's head straight to Supabase. Within Supabase, I'm going to click on the home button, and there's something we need to note. To create a table in Supabase, you can either use the table editor or the SQL editor. So I'm going to make use of these two options. So the first one, which is the table editor, is going to be used to create our message table, while this SQL editor is going to be used to create our users table. So to get started with this, I will need to copy some of the commands for the users table, which is within our readme file. In fact, to display this text text in a clear format, I'm going to open this using a markdown preview, which makes it look like an article. So you can see by the time I push this to GitHub, it's going to appear this way because it's in markdown format. So this is very clear to read. As you can see, you have for creating a users table, this is the command. To enable row level security, this is the command. Then to enable permits access for users to access their profile. So all the commands have their own heading. So everything is perfectly clear. So let's get started with creating the users table. So to create the users table, this is the command to create the users table. So I'm going to grab this and then head straight to Supabase and paste it within the SQL editor. Now you can see this query is untitled, so let's give it a name. So I'm going to click on rename, and luckily for Supabase has a Supabase AI that can help us to remove the burden of trying to come up with a name for our query. So I'm going to click on rename with the Supabase AI, and you can see it gives it a name as well as a description that fits the particular profile of our query. So I'm going to click on rename query. Now to execute this query, before I click on run to execute this query, you can see the preview. It says create table, which it says create a public table, and the table is going to have a ID with a type of UID, a full name with a type of text, an avatar URL with a type of text, and then a primary key, which is the ID we have right here. You can see the ID above it serves as our primary key. Now when I click on run, this table is going to get created for us. As you can see from the results, success, no rows returned. Now before we proceed, I want to quickly take us back to the table editor and let's see if a table has been created for us. As you can see, we now have a users table with an ID with a full name and then an avatar URL. Cool. Now let's head back to the avatar. Let's head back to the SQL editor rather, and then let's click on new query to create a new query for our users table. So the next thing we want to create is to enable row level security. So to enable row level security, I'm going to grab this SQL command and then head back to the SQL editor, paste it in, and then click on run. As you can see, row level security has been enabled, and automatically the Supabase AI helps us to generate the name, and by clicking on it again, it helps us to generate the description. And I'm going to click on rename query. So I'm going to click on new query once more, and I'm going to grab the next query, which is to permit users access to their profile. So users can access their profile when they want to access their profile. So I'm going to grab that policy, and then I'm going to paste it in, and then I'm going to rename the query by clicking on rename with AI Supabase or Supabase AI, as the case may be, and then I'm going to click on run. So we have more queries to run. So the next one is to permit users to update their profile if a user wants to update their profile. So I'm going to click on new query once more, and then I'm going to paste it in, click on the menu we have right there, click on rename query, rename with Supabase AI, and then click on rename query, then run the policy, that is the query, and you can see it's successfully integrated. So the next one is the Supabase function. So for the Supabase function, we need to grab this particular query, and I'm going to do a bit of breakdown for this. I'm going to click on new query and then paste it in. So as you can see, this function can be a bit trickish. Now, depending on the auth service you are using, the values need to follow along with the type of auth service you are using. For us, the auth service we are using, which is the Google Auth service, has a full name metadata as well as a avatar URL metadata. So if whatever Google authentication you are using, probably you are using GitHub or Apple or Discord, you need to check the metadata, because if you just copy this query which has a full name and avatar URL, it's going to return an error. It's not going to work. To make this more clear, I'm going to head back to my application, and then I'm going to head straight to probably the local storage. And within the local storage, you can see the user metadata rather. So under the user metadata, you can see I have something called avatar URL and I have a full name. So these particular keys are what I'm referencing in this particular database function, this query function. For GitHub and other authentication service, you may not see full name there, you may not see avatar URL there that reference the image, you may see other things, so you need to be careful of that. Whatever you want to reference, you need to check the user metadata and then reference it within the query. If I wanted the probably the phone number or the name or the picture, all I need to do is just to duplicate this, then change the string right here to picture or whatever is within this key right here. So I thought I should make that clear. So let's change the query name by clicking on rename with Supabase AI and then click on rename query. So I'm going to run that function and it says there's an error on line 8. I think this trailing comma shouldn't be there, so I'm going to click on run again, and this time around it's successful. Now I think the final thing we need to run is the Supabase trigger. So what this does basically is every time a new user signs in, it saves their data into the data table. It triggers the table to save the new user. So I'm going to paste that in. So it's going to insert each new user into the users table. We're going to see how that works once we integrate it with our Angular front-end application. So I'm going to click on rename query, rename with Supabase AI, and then click on rename query. Then we can run the trigger. And with that, we've created all the queries for our user table. So I'm going to go back to the table editor rather, and then select users. So you can see under the auth policy, we have two policies, the select and update policy created for us because we did it through the SQL editor. So normally you should be able to do this using the table editor. If you decide to create a new table by making use of the table editor format, you need to fill the forms. But to do that, that will be when we start creating our messages table. But for now, we need to create the row level security. We need to enable it for our users table. I think that's the last thing we need to do as far as this table is concerned. So to do that, I'm going to click on auth policies, and then I'm going to click on create a new policy. So this policy is going to be select. So there are different policies. You have the select, the insert, the updates, delete, and the all policies. But for this case, we have the select, and I'm going to set the expression to true. So that is the users have read access. So I'm going to give it a policy name. For this form, we don't have Supabase AI to help us out, so we need to just say probably enable read access. So we've enabled read access, so users can access their profile by setting it to true, and then we can now click on save policy, and we've been able to create a row level security for our users table. So to test this out, you can see currently we have no users. The table is currently empty. So what I'm going to do is under authentication, I'm going to delete the current user we have. I'm going to delete this user, and then I'm going to log out, clear the local storage, open up console, and then I'm going to refresh the application to ensure everything is in sync. So the idea is anytime a new user registers into the application, we now have them available within the users table. So I'm going to open up the table editor and select users, and let's see when a new user logs in, if we are able to retrieve the ID, the full name, and the avatar URL. This data is going to be what we use within our application, within our Angular application to display the user's full name as well as the image. So let's see. I'm going to click on sign up using Google once again. Then I'm going to select this account, and as you can see, we are signed in. So I'm going to head straight to Supabase, and as you can see, we now have this data. We have the ID, we have the full name, and we have the user URL, the avatar URL rather. So I'm going to grab this avatar URL. Let me copy everything, and then let's paste it here. Let's see what it displays. You can see it displays the avatar of that particular user, which is available on Google. So we can now persist that particular image within our chat application right here. Every time a new user signs in, the trigger gets activated, and then it saves the data within our users table. So it can save as many users as possible that signs into the application. So I think that is the implementation for the users table. So the next thing is to create another table, which is the message table. So to create the message table, I'm going to click on create a new table. This time we are not using the SQL editor. So I want us to learn the difference between using the SQL editor and then using the form we have right here to create the different tables. So using the user interface, let's give the table a name. So I'm going to call this table chat. For description, I'm going to skip that for now. Enable row level access, yes, I'm going to say that's true. And then another thing is, because this is the chat, we want to enable real-time broadcast. That is, every time a message is being sent to this table, we want to display it in real time instead of having to reload the page. So we need to set that true. So the next thing we need to do is, remember, we are following this particular schema. That is, the table needs to have an ID, a created at field, a text field, an editable field, and a sender field. So back to the Supabase, we need to change the ID from int8 to UUID, and then we can set the default value to a random ID. Then the created at, we're going to leave it the way it is. So we're going to add a new column, and the new column is going to be it's going to be text, and it's going to be a type of text as well. And then next up, before we create another column, we don't want this to be nullable, so I'm going to disable this field. So the next thing is to create the editable field. This allows the user to determine whether they can edit their data or not. So it's going to be a boolean. So for default value, we're going to set it to false. This is not going to be nullable as well. And then finally, we have the sender. So the person that sends the message is also going to be a UUID as well. And then the type is going to be auth UID. So it's not going to be nullable as well. So we need to also add a foreign key relation. So to add the foreign key relation, I'm going to select the add foreign key, and then it's going to be in a public schema, and then the table is going to be the users table, and then we can connect it using the sender UID, and then we're going to make use of the UID. So I think that's all. For the actions, we need to set the actions. We need to cascade the actions. So I'm going to select cascade. So anytime the update happens, it's going to update all the records reference to this table. Same thing for the deleting as well. It's going to update all the records in the table. So I'm going to save, and with that, we've been able to configure the foreign key relation by connecting the sender ID with the current user ID. So I think that's all we need to do. So I'm going to click on save, and then I think we're good to go. Now, the final implementation for this chat table is to add row level security policies. So this is going to have about 3 to 4 row level security policies. So the first policy is going to be the delete policy. So for the delete policy, I'm going to select delete, and then delete is going to be called delete by user ID, and then I'm going to scroll down, and the SQL expression is going to be if the auth ID, auth.uid rather, if the auth.uid is equals to the sender ID, then you can delete your message. That means you're able to delete your own message. You can't delete someone else's message. So that's the condition, the SQL condition for this particular policy. So I'm going to save. So that's all for the delete policy. Now, okay, there's an error. Oh, I used 3 equals to. It's supposed to be a single equals to. I'm used to writing so much JavaScript. I'm sorry about that. So the next thing is to create another policy. This time, probably let's create the insert policy. This policy helps to determine how we want to insert data. Only authenticated users can insert data. And quick pause before we proceed with that particular insert policy. There's something I missed with the delete policy. Only authenticated user can delete. Once a user is logged in, they are the only ones that can delete a particular message. So I forgot to call that. So now we can now create a new policy called insert. So for the insert policy, we are going to call it insert for authenticated users. And then the SQL expression for this is going to be if the sender is equals to the auth.uid and created underscore at is equals to now. So if the sender ID is equals to the auth ID, that is if the authenticated user ID is equals to the person trying to send the message, and then the date of the creation is the current date, then the user is able to insert data. So I'm going to click on insert before I skip that. I'm going to save this policy. So the next policy we are going to create is the read policy, ability to read the policy. So I'm going to call this read access. So as usual, only authenticated users can read this message. A user that is not authenticated cannot read a message. So all we need to do is just to set it to true. It's a boolean. So once you're authenticated, then you can read a message. So I'm going to save this policy, and then the final policy we need to create is the update policy. Although this feature is not created within this application, but for the sake of people who might want to integrate it into the project, so I'm just going to create this policy. So I'm going to call it update user based on ID. So the public role is going to be authenticated, and then we're going to say if the auth.uid is equals to sender ID, then we are allowed to update the message. So you can only update a message if it's the message you created yourself. So I'm going to save this policy, and those are all the policies we need to create for our message table. So I'm going to go back to the table editor, and you can see on the chart table we have 4 auth policies, and on the users table we have just 3 auth policies. So with that, we can now try to integrate this within our Angular application. So what we want to do now is to interact with our chart table in Supabase. We need to have the ability to create a new chart, then fetch the newly created chart in real time, and as well as delete the created charts. And to do that, we need to make use of services in Angular. So let's create the services folder. So back to the terminal, I'm going to stop the current terminal and then run a new command using ng generate service, and it's going to be within a Supabase folder. So within the Supabase folder, we're going to have our chart service. So I'm going to press enter, and then the new service will be generated for us. Now that our new service has been generated, let's head back to Visual Studio Code and try to locate where this service is created. So within this folder called Supabase, we can see the chart service, and within this chart service we need to reference an instance of the Supabase client, which we already did in the auth service. So to make this process easier and faster, I'm just going to head to the auth service and grab the Supabase variable instance and then paste it within the chart service instance. We need to import Supabase client. Another thing we need to do is to grab the code within the constructor. So I'm going to grab this, and then I'm going to paste it right beneath our declaration, and we're going to wrap the constructor with the brackets. So we still have error messages because we haven't imported the right modules. So I'm going to import create client as well as environment. And with that, we are good to go, and we can now reference Supabase within this Angular application, within this Angular service. So the first integration is going to be the ability to create a new chart in our application. So to do that, we need to create a new function. So let's call this function chart message. So to do that, let's just say a sync chart message, and this is going to take an argument, and it's going to be an argument of type of text of string, because we need to pass in a text. And remember, within our Supabase chart table, we have a text which also accepts a type of string as well. So we need to configure it in a way whereby anything we type within the input field can be saved within our chart table. So within a try catch block, I'm going to say try and then catch, and the catch is going to have an argument of error, and then we can alert error. So let's create a variable object, and within this variable object we are going to have 2 arguments. So the first one is going to be the data, and then we have error. So we're going to set it equals to await this dot Supabase dot from, and we're going to try and access the data from, we're trying to reference a database table which is called charts. If you head back to Supabase, you can see that we called our Supabase name charts, our Supabase table chart, and then we want to insert. So we have different options. We have delete, fetch, select, but for this situation, we want to insert into the Supabase table. So what are we trying to insert? We are trying to insert the payload of text, which is the argument we have up here. So now that that is determined, we can now create a condition that says if error, that is, if an error occurs during this process, we want to alert error dot message. So if there's no error, so we can proceed to return the data. So I think that's what we need to do. I'm going to save that, and let's head straight to our chat component to access this particular service. So within the chat component.cs file, I'll need to create a new method as well. So this method is going to be called onSubmit because we are trying to submit the charts and push it to our database table. So within this onSubmit method, we need to create a form to make this work. So what do I mean by this? When I head back to the browser, anything within this input field, we want to send it straight into our charts table. So to get any data within this input field, we need to make use of reactive form for this project. So to do this, we need to import some API from Angular forms, which include form builder, form group, the reactive form modules, as well as validators. Let's get started with the reactive form module. So within the imports array, let's import the reactive forms module. As you can see, we have it imported above. Another thing we need to import is the form group. So we need to create an instance of the chat form. So we can just say chats form, and then we're going to attach it to an instance of form group, which we need to import as well. And we need to attach this variable to an initializer by making use of the exclamation mark. And with that, we can now head straight to the constructor. Currently we don't have any constructor here, so I'm going to create a constructor, and within the constructor we can just run this dot chat form, which is the name of our chat, and then we're going to say is equals to this dot. So we need the form builder for us to be able to have an instance of the group object. So to do that, we need to create a new variable. So I'm going to say private fb, which serves as form builder. I'm going to say is equals to, here we need to make use of inject. So I'm going to say inject. What are we injecting? We're injecting the form builder, which we need to import. So let's import the form builder. We already have inject imported, but I would like to move this above the chat form variable. So let's just do that now. So everything that has inject is above, and every other variable comes below. So everything we create is in an organized format. So we can just say this dots fb dots, then we have access to array, control, group, and nullable, as well as record. But what we need is the group. So this dot form builder dot group, and then we need to open a parenthesis and a bracket, and within this curly brace brackets, we need to create another key, and this key is going to be called chat message. So chat message, and we can just open a bracket. It takes in two arguments. So the first argument is going to be the initial value, which is going to be an empty array. Then we can make it a required field by saying validators dot required. Validators is also imported from Angular form. So this chat message is also going to be referenced within the HTML file. This allows us to attach it to the particular field we are trying to get the data from. So we need to head straight to the HTML file. So let's head to chat component.html, and this is where our form should be within this input field. We want to get the data that is being typed within this input tag. So we need to wrap this div around the form. So what I'm going to do is to create a form tag. It doesn't need this attribute of action. We don't need that. So I'm just going to cut this closing tag and then wrap it around the div. And then we need to reference the name of our form, which is called chat form, by binding into the form group. So I'm just going to say form group is equals to chat form. And then we need to also use the ng-submit event handler to reference the submit function. So we can just open a parenthesis and then say ng-submit, and then we can say is equals to the name of our method, which is called onSubmit. So I'm going to pass it here, and it's going to have a parenthesis at the end as well. And finally, let's make use of form control name to access the data within this input tag. So we can just say form control name, which is going to be equals to the name we called this particular key within the constructor, so which is chat message. So I'm just going to attach it to the form control name, which is chat message. This allows us to access all the value within the input tag rather. So I think that's all we need to do for now. So let's try to log anything we type within the inputs field within the console. Let's try to log it into the console. So I'm going to head back to VS Code, and then we can just do const form value is equals to this dot chat form dot value dot chat underscore message. So let's console log this variable into the console by saying form value. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far and then restart the server by typing in ng serve. Now that our compilation is complete, we can head back to the browser on localhost 4200 and then reload the entire page. So once this is done, I'm going to clear the console and then let's type probably 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 and then click on send. You can see we now have the value of the input field in the console anytime we click on send. So this value is what we want to send to our chat database within the text schema. So let's head back to Visual Studio Code and then let's reference our service. So what we need to do next is to inject the Supabase service, that is the chat service, within this component. So I'm just going to duplicate this and it's going to be called chat underscore service, and then we're going to call the chat service within the Supabase directory. So now that that is injected into this particular file, we can now make use of the this keyword by saying this dot chat service dot chat message. The chat message expects a payload, that is the field, that is the value within the field, which is called form value. So I'm going to pass it within this parenthesis, and then we can now say dot then, because it's returning a promise, and the promise we can give an argument of response, although currently we don't need to make use of this argument, but let's pass in an argument and then open a bracket, and within the bracket we can just probably console log the response to see if you are getting any form of response from the database, and then we can make use of catch to catch any form of error that may be coming from the database. Make use of the fat arrow, and then we can alert any error that is coming from database by making use of error.message. So I'm going to save, and then so let's try and see if we get any data within our database when we send a value into the input field. So for now, I can just type something within the input field. We are getting an error. Let me reload the page. Probably the compiler didn't compile properly. So within this input field, when we type something, we're going to see if we get a response in our database in real time, or if we get an error. Pin the value, this is a text, and to ensure that we are hitting the service, I'm going to open up the network tab. I'm going to clear everything in there, and I'm going to click on send, and as you can see, we get a response of 200 created, and then we can see the text payload as well as the it doesn't return any preview, but we can see the payload being sent, and then it shows the status code of created. So I'm going to rush straight to the chat database, and you can see we have the value. This is a text. The editable boolean is returning false. We have the sender ID, the created art, as well as the user ID. So everything is working smoothly, and we can now insert data into the database. So let's insert more data. We can just say this is another test. I'm going to send that, and then in the network tab, we can see that is also successful. Let's send in another message to make it 3. The third message, and then let's click on send. You can see all this data is sent to database, and it is reflecting in real time without having to refresh the page. So there are a few modifications I would like to make. For instance, anytime we type in a text, I want the message to clear off. Like anytime we type in a random text or a text or an input into the input field, the message still stays. So let's reset the form anytime we type in a message. In the service file, I noticed there seems to be a warning, and the warning says not all code parts returns a value. So in this case, what I'm going to do to get rid of this warning is probably to get rid of this return data. So with that, I think we should still be able to send data to the database. What I want to do now is to reset the form, and in reactive form, you can do that easily by referencing the form name by saying this dot chat form, and then you can say dot reset. Okay, the reference to the reset method is after the chat form, so it's going to be this dot chat form dot reset. So I'm going to add the parenthesis at the end. So let's test that out to see if the form gets cleared immediately we submit the data in the input field. So I'm going to type in, probably I'm going to get some data from this static text. I'm just going to paste it within the input form, and I'm going to click on send. As you can see, the text gets cleared immediately. The data gets sent to the database. So with that, we are good to go with clearing the input field. Another thing we need to do is maybe we shouldn't allow someone to send an empty field to the database, because currently when the field is empty and I click on send, okay, although we do get an alert that says null constraints, it violates the null constraints, but we need to prevent this in the front end as well, because this still gets sent to the database or not. I think the database handles that, but in an ideal situation that shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't have a scenario where we can type in we can send data using the send button in an empty input field. So to prevent that, we need to make use of the disabled attribute. So we're gonna make use of the square brackets, and I'm gonna call disabled, and then say if not chat form dot valid, that is, if the chat form is not valid, disable the input field. So you see now that the compilation is complete, this send button is grayed out. You can't click on it because the input field is grayed out. So but when you paste something or when you type in something, then it gets enabled, so you can only send that to the database. So that's how that works, and how we can handle trying to submit an empty field to the database. But also we can see that Supabase helps to undo that, because of the way we configure the database. That is, null is not allowed for the type of text. It's not nullable. That's why it was not submitting previously when I was trying to submit the empty input field. Now we can see that we are able to send data to the database. Now what I want to do now is to be able to fetch this data, this dynamic data, from our database into our application. What we currently have is a bunch of static tests in our HTML file, which you can find right here. But what I want to do next is let's fetch it within an array and then loop over it and display it into the front end. So the integration for that is going to start with the service. So within the service, we're going to create a new function, and we're going to call this function list message. Make use of the async keyword and say lists. Instead of list message, let's call it list chat, since we've been using the chat keyword consistently throughout this tutorial. So let's say list chat, and I'm going to make use of the try catch block once again. So I'm going to say try and then make use of the catch block, and the catch block is going to take an argument of error, and then we can just throw the error. So by making use of the throw keyword, throw error, and within the try block, let's integrate the functionality. So we need to create a variable, a destructured variable of data as well as error. So we're going to set this equals to await this dot supabase dot from, and this is trying to reference the particular table we are trying to speak to in Supabase, which is called chat. So from the chat table, we want to select all the messages from the authenticated users. So to do that, we're going to open up a string and then make use of asterisks. That is, we're trying to select all the messages from the authenticated users. This would be in lowercase, in fact, not uppercase. And then we're going to make it open a parenthesis, and the parenthesis is going to have an asterisk as well. And that's all we need to do to select all the messages from the authenticated users. So once this is done, we need to create an if condition. I'm just going to grab this if condition we created in the chat message, and then I'm going to paste it right below our destructured data and error variable, and below that we are going to return the data. So I'm just going to make use of the return keyword and then return the data. Then I'm going to save everything we've done so far. So this is the service that will allow us to fetch all the chat data from the chat table. So now we need to speak with this particular service in our chat component CS file. So within the chat component CS file, we need to create a new method. So I'm just going to call this method on lists chats. So it has no arguments, it's just straightforward. So we can just access the list chat method from our service by saying this dot chat service dot lists chat, and then this returns the promise. So I'm going to make use of dot then, and then no pun intended, I'm going to pass in an argument of response, and then let's console log the response, and then let's undo the catch because of a scenario where we have an error. So we can just give it an argument of error, make use of the fat arrow, and then we can just alert error.message to help us undo the error. Now what I would like to do is to call this on list chart within the effects. So effects are available in Angular 17. They are one of the reactive primitives in signals, and they can only run within an injection context, and such an injection context includes the constructor. So the effect can only work within the constructor. So let's call the effect, and then we're gonna pass in an anonymous arrow function, and then we can just do this dot the name of our method we're trying to log in the console, which is on list chart. I think that's what we need to do. We just need to import the effects, and if we scroll above, you can see effect is imported into the @Angular core library over there. So we can save everything we've done so far and see if we get the response on line 67, which should contain all the charts data from the database. So quickly, let's head to the browser and let's see if we get that response. As you can see, we get all the response from the database in an array. We currently have 5 charts in an array in the data table, and then we have this users object. So if I go back to the charts table, you can see we have 5 data currently imputed. So we have access to those 5 data as well as the users who are sending those data. So currently I'm the only one sending the charts. That's why my full name is currently having my name, and then it's currently having my avatar URL as well as my ID. If someone else logs in and sends a message, it's going to have different values over here. So let's try to display these 5 responses within our chat user interface, because currently what we have is just a bunch of static data. So quickly, let's head back to Visual Studio Code, and to do that, we need to make use of signals to undo the data from the table. So I don't want to make use of observable to undo this. I want to make use of signal. So to make use of signal, we need to scroll up. So I'm going to declare a variable called charts, and it's going to be assigned to a signal which has just been imported above. As you can see, we now have signal imported in Angular core, and it's going to be an empty array by default. So what I'm going to do is to open a parenthesis and then pass in an empty array. But in this scenario, we need to create an interface that handles the response we are expecting from the data from the Supabase table. So let's quickly create an interface. So within the app directory, I'm going to create a folder called interface, and within this folder, I'm going to call it charts-response.ts. So within this, let's create our interface. It's going to be modeled after our response. So let's just say export interface, and then it's going to be called iChat, and it's going to be within this object. So all the data we get from the database is going to be represented within our interface. So quickly, we're going to have the first one, which is called created at. So we're going to have created underscore at is going to be a type of string. Then the next one is going to be editable. This is going to be a boolean. Then we also have the ID, which obviously has to be a type of string. Then we have the sender, it's going to be a type of string as well. And then we have the type of text, which is our message. So it's going to be a type of string. And then we have the users, which is an object on its own, and it has 3 objects: the avatar URL, the ID, as well as the full name. If you check the response, you see it right here: the avatar URL, the full name, and the ID. So let's have it within this object. So I'm going to say avatar underscore URL, which is going to be a type of string, and then ID, type of string. And finally, we have the full name, full underscore name. It's going to be a type of string as well. So our interface is created. So we need to import it and assign it to the signal, because signals can also take in types as well. So let's assign it to this signal by saying iCharts, which we need to import. And with that, it seems we have an error that says type never is not assignable to parameter of iChart, and it's missing some properties, which includes created at, editable, ID, and the like. So we are going to undo this error down below. from our response. Or probably we can also set the iChat interface as an empty array. So all I need to do is just to reference this empty array. So with that error message from TypeScript disappears. So right now, let's assign our response to this chat signal so we can have access to all these signal primitives. So to do that, down below within our function, this .chat.set, because it's a signal, we have access to the set method. The set method, what it does basically is it allows us to set a new value to our variable. So whatever is coming from this response is going to be referenced within the chat variable. It's going to be available throughout the application within the chat variable. So we can just pass in res. So we are setting the response. So we have an error that says argument of type null is not assignable to parameter of type iChat. So we need to handle this error. So one way of doing this is to assign a type to our argument from our response. So I'm just going to say type of iChat, and then it's going to be an empty array by default, and we are still getting an error that says void is not assignable to type of parameter. This is a TypeScript errors that might get you confused, but I think we can handle this by saying or null. So you can see with that the error gets disappeared. So but we need to create a condition that also handles the response by saying if the response is not equals to null. If the response is not equals to null, then we want to set data into the chat variable in our signal, which we defined above right here. So this is going to contain our response. So if the response is not null, let's pass the data into the chat variable from our signal. Else we can just console log that no messages was found, no messages found. Or you can probably display an alert or probably something to signify that to the users on the front end. So this is one way to undo this, and with that we can loop through the UI by making use of this .chat signal. So to do that, let's head straight to the user interface, and where we will need to loop through it is somewhere around here. To be precise, that will be below the columns, this area where we have the different columns. So I'm just going to extend this and then see where this ends. And to do that, we're going to make use of the newly introduced control flows in Angular, which is the @4 block. It allows us to loop through data. So I'm going to say @4, and then I'm going to say MSG, which represents messages of this .chats. You need to make use of your parenthesis here at the end, and then I'm going to make use of the track keyword so that it allows the signal to know if any item changed within the array. So I'm going to make use of the track keyword, and I'm going to open a bracket. So I'm going to wrap everything within the brackets where the div ends. So this is one way to loop through it using the newly introduced @4 block. It's chats, not chat. So if this message of this .chat, then the track, then we can now say @empty, that is if the result is empty, the newly introduced control flows allows us to handle that as well. So if the array is empty, we can just display a div to the user interface that says no chat available. So with that, we are good to go. So I'm going to save, and let's see how the user interface currently looks. As you can see, it displays the static data 5 times. So now we can just access the keys within the array. So the first one we're going to reference is going to be the image, I think the avatar URL. So we can just make use of the curly brace, the double curly brace, by saying msg dot that will be the users dot avatar URL. So I'm going to make use of optional chain for this to handle this particular scenarios. So the next one is the time. So let's handle the time. So we'll make use of date pipes for this. So I can just say within this div, let's make use of the interpolation, and then say msg, that is the message dot created at, and then we make use of a pipe, and then we can now say date and make use of a colon. This is a pipe in Angular. It's all available in the documentation, so I'm not just coming up with this. So you can check the documentation for date pipes in Angular. Then I'm going to make use of the month. I'm going to reference the day as well as the year, and also I want to show the time. So let's say comma, the hours, then the minutes, and then the time zone probably is in the afternoon, that is AM or PM. So I want to reference that, but we are having an error in these days that says no pipe was found with the date, with name date. So we need to inject it into our import array. We need to import date pipe. So right after reactive forms, I can just say date pipe and then inject it within or from at Angular common. So with that error gets cleared. So the next thing we need to display to the user is the full name of the user. Currently we have Sharon Doe, but we want this to be dynamic. So let's just say msg.users.fullname. Okay, another thing we need to do is we need to interpolate the message itself. So that's quite easy. We can just say msg.text. That's what we called it in database. And I think that's all. And I'm going to save. Let's save everything we've done so far. And then let's check the browser. I'm going to close the console so we can see everything properly. As you can see, we now have all the messages from the database. So what I want to do now is every time we enter a new chat, I want it to display immediately on the front end, because currently if I say, let's just type in a random text, if I click on send, I need to refresh the page for us to see the newly typed in text, which you can see right here. But I want it to happen in a scenario where anytime we click on send, we see the response immediately. And to do that, all we need to do is just to call the onList chat. We need to call it within the onSubmit function. So we can just say this dot onList chat. So I'm going to save and let's see how this works. So let me just type in a text by saying, yeah, I am. I'm going to click on send. You can see it's showing immediately. Everything we type gets fetched immediately from the database in a reactive format in real time. So with that, we are able to fetch the data in real time from the database. So we can now move on to the next implementation, which is ability to delete a chat. So to create the delete functionality, we are going to pass through 3 basic steps. So the first step involves us trying to access the particular data we are trying to delete from the chat components. That is, within the chat components, once the user selects the message they want to delete from a drop down, that particular object is going to get passed down to the message service, that is our chat service. So within the chat service, we are going to assign that particular object to a signal by making use of the set method in signal. So once we set that particular object in the message service, then we are going to access it within the delete component itself. The delete component is going to have its own separate modal. So within that modal, that is where we are going to finalize the deleting of the message. I hope this doesn't sound too complicated, but I think once I start the implementation, you are going to see how easy it works. So let's head back to Visual Studio Code. So within Visual Studio Code, we need to create a new component. And in fact, this is going to be within a layout folder. So let's generate a new component by saying ng generate components. And then we are going to call the layout folder and then pass in the delete modal component. So I'm going to press enter, and while that is getting generated, we can head back to the browser and head straight to Bootstrap 5. So in Bootstrap 5, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get 2 things. The first one is the modal and the second one is the drop down. So let's get the user interface for the modal. So I'm going to search for modal within Bootstrap 5. So let's search for modal and then let's scroll down. I think I'm going to go with this particular modal. So it has a text and then it has 2 buttons. So one button is going to be yes, another one is going to be no, and then we have a text that says, do you want to delete this particular message? So let's grab this. I'm going to grab everything here, then copy it, and then head straight to our chat components, and it's going to be below the main tag. So I'm just going to say modal. So this is going to be within a comment, and then I'm going to paste everything we copied. So now that we have the modal, the way we want to access this modal is through a drop down. So once a user sees a menu over here, once they click on the menu, a drop down appears. Once they click on the drop down, a modal appears. So what I'm going to do next is to grab the drop down. So I'm going to search for drop down in Bootstrap. So we're going to see the different drop downs available for us. I think we can go with this very first drop down we have over here. So I'm going to grab everything within this div as well. So where this is going to be is within the loop, within the @for loop. So we can just put it probably after the div that contains the message.text. So I'm going to paste it in there. Then I'm going to save, and let's clear out this drop down button. I'm going to put 3 dots that serves as a menu in place of the text. So I'm going to save that. Another thing I'm going to do is I don't want this to show as a button, so I'm going to remove the button class by removing btn secondary, as well as the drop down toggle class. And I'm going to save. Let's see how it currently looks on the user interface. So we need to compile the projects once more by typing in ng-serve, and now the compilation is complete. Let's head back to the browser, and we can see the menu doesn't look the way we want, so we need to make some slight adjustments still. So this button tag, I'm going to change it to a span tag. So I'm going to remove the button, I'm going to type in span, and I think that should get rid of the weirdness of this menu. Cool. So we have this. So but I don't want it to be so close to the message box, so I can just give it a class of margin top of 3 and then margin left of 5. So I'm going to save, and let's see how this looks now. I think it's much better. So you can see when we click on the drop down, we have the options displaying from the drop down, but I just want only one option, which is going to be the delete text. So I'm going to get rid of these two and can just have delete right here. And seems I messed something up. Okay, we didn't delete all the tags. So now we can save, and then let's see how the drop down works once again. So I'm going to click on the drop down. You can see I'm going to change the text to delete and not action. So with that, the next thing we want to do is, once the drop down shows, the delete we have right here is meant to trigger the modal. So what do I mean by this? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down to where we have the modal, and I'm going to grab some attributes we have here. So one of the attributes includes the database toggle as well as the database target. So I'm going to cut that and then get rid of this button, and then I'm going to paste it within the a tag in our drop down. So let's paste it somewhere here, and this should trigger the modal. So let's click on the menu again, click on delete. You can see the modal now shows. Cool. So I don't want the modal to show within these components. We need some separation of concern, so we need to cut it and then paste it within the modal components, which is within the layouts folder. So let's go right to the HTML, paste it in. So this is where our modal is going to live, but we need to grab the selector. So I'm going to grab this selector, head back to our chart components, and replace the UI with the selector. And we have self-closing tags available in Angular now, so let's make use of a self-closing tag and then inject that component in our import array. So I'm just going to say delete modal components and then save everything we've done so far. So now our UI looks more modular and easy to understand. So we can just head back to the user interface and see if the modal still appears with the change we've made, and you can see the modal still appears. So I'm going to change the text within our delete modal. Instead of having these 3 dots we have here, we can just replace it with a text that says, are you really sure you want to delete this message? So let's type that out. Are you really sure you want to delete this message? If you really want to delete this message, if you click on yes, it's going to get deleted. If you click on no, the modal gets closed. So that is pretty much straightforward. And from the presentation I showed before we begin this implementation, we need to start the integration of the delete from the chart components TS file. So what that means is we need to create a new function for our delete functionality to work. That is, anytime we select the particular text we want to delete, we need to grab the objects. Anytime we click on this drop down and click on delete, we are grabbing the objects we are trying to delete. That is the chart we are trying to delete. So to see that in action, let's head back to this chart components TS file, and within this file we can just say open drop down. That is that's the drop down that shows the delete text. So we're gonna create a function. This function will allow us to grab the object of the message we plan to delete. So I can just say msg and then give it a type of iChat. Then we can now say this dot. Okay, we need to console log it first to be sure. So I'm just going to console log msg. But for us to see the details in the console, we need to call it in our HTML template. So that's going to be within the span tag. So within the span tag, we can just have a click event handler, and then let's paste in our function and then save everything we've done so far. We need to paste in the particular variable as well, that is the argument, so which is going to be MSG. That's why we're getting that error. So we need to pass in MSG, then we need to open the console to be sure we are getting the right object. So the first one we're going to try is, let's try this particular text that says this is another text. Once I click on that, you can see we get the particular object, which is this is another text. So if I try to grab another one, probably this Latin text, you can see we grab that. So we can easily use the drop down to delete that particular message. All we need to do is just to pass it down to our service, which is going to be the next step. So let's pass this data down to our service. So let's head to our chat service, and within the chat service, we need to create the function that helps us to grab the selected object. So I'm just gonna call the method selected chat. So let's just say selected chat, and then it's going to have an argument of MSG and then iChat, which is the interface. And then we can now create a signal above. So the signal is going to be called saved chat. So what I need to do is just to say public, because we want to access this particular signal in our modal. So we can just say saved chat is equals to signal, which is going to be an empty object by default. So all we need to do is just to say this dot saved chat, and then we need to pass in the MSG, that is the message you are grabbing from the chat component. But we need to make use of the set method, which I forgot. So we need to set it to the latest object we are trying to grab. So let's not forget that we are making use of sets. Anytime you make use of signals, you have access to these primitives. So next up, we need to head back to our chat component and reference this particular selected chat function. So within the drop down function, all we need to do is just to reference the message service, or that is the chat service, by saying this just chat service dot selected chats and then passing MSG. So we are able to pass down the object from our chat service, from our chat component rather, down to our chat service. And in the chat service, it's now available globally in the Angular project through the signal called save chat. So we can always retrieve this in our delete modal component. To see that in action, let's head straight to the delete modal component. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far and then close some of the tabs, because I think we have so many tabs currently open and it's going to cause some confusion. So let's head straight to the delete modal and log the selected chats into the console to see what I'm talking about. So all we need to do is just to create the instance of the chat service. So let's just say private chat underscore service, and we need to make use of the injector. So we're gonna say equals to inject, which we need to import, and then we reference the chat service. So we now have an instance of the chat service. Before we proceed, let's just define the constructor and then log the particular object from our modal, our delete modal, into the console to be sure we have access to the data that was selected. So I'm going to open this constructor because we are going to make use of the effects to log this into the console, and we know the effect can only work within an injection context. So we need to import it within the constructor and then open an anonymous arrow function, and then we can just do console.log this dot chat service dot saved chats and then pass in the parentheses. So I'm going to save, and then let's open up the drop down and see if we get to log the data in the delete component modal. So let's select one of the chats. So I'm going to go with the last chat, which is a bunch of random string, and you can see in the delete modal component we have access to the right data we just selected. You can see if we select another one, you can see we have access to it in the delete component modal. So you can see we've been able to use signal to manage states from one component to another component in an Angular application. I mean, the code base is kind of very simple to understand compared to observables where you have so many boilerplate code. So if you are new to signals, this is one of the reasons why you might want to try out signals. So let's continue with the integration. So to proceed, we need to create the delete service for our delete implementation, and that can be done in our chat service. So to do that, we're going to create a very simple method. So let's head to the chat service, and right above the selected chat, we can just say async delete chat, and all we need to delete a chat is an ID. So, and it's going to be a type of string. So we're going to open the object, and then we can create a variable by saying const data. One thing you should know about Supabase is when you delete data, you don't get any response. So we don't need to handle anything when it comes to deleting of data. So you just get no response. So we can just say const data. We're gonna say await this dot Supabase, just like we've done previously, dot from our chat table, and then we can do dot delete, and then it's gonna take a parenthesis, and then we can say dot eq, and then we're gonna open a bracket, and within this bracket we're gonna reference the ID of the chat we're trying to delete, and that's all we need to do, and we can just return the data. So I'm just gonna make use of the return keyword and then return the data. So this is the simple service function to delete a particular chat. So we can now integrate this within the delete modal. Since we have access to all the objects, we can just reference the ID and delete the specific chat we want to delete. So we need to create a function for that. So that function is going to be called delete chat. So within the delete chat function, we need to extract the ID of the chat we're trying to delete. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called ID. So I'm going to say const ID, and let's try to access it through our signal by saying this dot chat service dot saved chat, and then because it's a string, we can just make use of the as keyword in TypeScript by saying as, and then open an object, and then we can say ID of string, and all we need to do is just wrap everything within a bracket, a parenthesis. So I'm going to wrap this within the parenthesis, and I'm going to say dot ID. This is pretty much clear. Probably I need to break this down a little bit. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to access the ID of the chat we're trying to delete by making use of dot ID. So in the results from our delete object, once I click on a particular drop down, you can see we have ID. We are trying to get this ID. So that's why we're making use of .id right here. This is what we need to pass as an argument in the delete chat service. So I hope that is pretty much clear. So let's now reference it. In fact, let's console log the ID to be sure I know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to do console.log ID. Oh, this is outside the function. I'm going to cut this, put it within the function, and then let's make use of the click event handler within our user interface. This is the particular button we want to use to delete. So I'm just going to make use of the click event handler and then paste in the method. Then I'm going to save everything done so far. So when I click on yes, we should be able to see the ID in the console. So let's do that. Click on delete, and then I'm going to clear the console, and I'm going to click on yes. You can see we now have access to the ID. So this is where we are going to call the delete chat service. So let's head back to our TS file, and then we can now say this dot message service, or rather chat service, chat underscore service dot delete chat, and then we pass in the ID, which is a type of string, and like usual it returns a promise, and we need to make use of dot then. So I can just make use of an anonymous function which has a fat arrow, and then within this context we can just try to close the modal or probably route the user to another page or something of sort. But for now, I'm going to leave that block empty, and then I'm going to make use of dot catch, and within the dot catch, it's going to have an argument of error, make use of a fat arrow, then we can console log the error or probably alert the error dot message. Depending on what you want to do, you can handle it however way you want. So I'm going to save, and let's try to see if we can delete a chat right now. So I want us to try to delete this first chat we have here, which is, this is a text. Currently we have 9 chats. So let's take note of that. So I'm going to click on the drop down, click on the modal, and then I'm going to click on yes. So on the network tab, the result we have is 204 no content. I told you previously that anytime we make use of the delete method in Supabase, we usually get no response, and you can see it from here. We have no content, and I believe this particular data has been deleted. To confirm that, let's head straight to the database, and you can see that this is a text just got removed in real time. So for now, what I want to happen is, how I want to handle it, this is once we click on yes and a delete happens, we want to close the modal immediately and then refresh the UI without reloading the entire page, because currently to see this in action I need to refresh the entire page for us to see that that particular text has been deleted. You can see it's no more there. If I delete this second one, I will need to refresh the entire user interface, which is not really good for a single page application rather. So let's try to implement that, and to do that we are going to make use of the router in Angular. So let's begin our implementation by calling the router object. So what I'm going to do is to create a private variable called router, and I'm going to set that to inject. Within the injection context, I'm going to call router, which we need to import, and you can see we have router imported from @angular/router. So this is going to be done within the promise where we have a successful response. So we can start this implementation by creating a variable which says current URL. So we can just say let's current URL. What I'm basically trying to do is just to get rid of the modal one and then ensure we have ensure that the user have the latest data from the database in Supabase without refreshing or reloading the page. So that's what we're trying to do here. So I can now say let's current URL. I typed ULR instead of URL. Sorry about that. Then we can now say this router.url. So this router.url, we can now say this router.navigate by URL, and this is going to take in two arguments. The first one is going to be a empty /, and then we're going to pass in an object that says skip location change. We're going to set it to true. So I'm going to type in skip location change. This is going to be set as true. So that returns a promise. We need to change that promise by making use of the then keyword, and it's going to be an empty or an anonymous function. And within that context, we can now say this router.navigate, and then we want to navigate to the current URL without reloading the entire page. So because if we reload the entire page, it defeats the purpose of this being a simple page application. But before we save and test it out, I also want to close the modal when the response is successful as well. So to do that, we need to make use of attribute binding, and we're going to make use of the Signal API to handle this. So back in the delete modal, we have an attribute called data-bs-dismiss. This is the attribute that helps us to dismiss the modal. So I'm going to grab this particular attribute, and then I'm going to bind to it in anytime we click on yes, because when we click on no, it dismisses the modal automatically. But when we click on yes, there's no way we are handling the closing of the modal. So we need to make use of attribute binding to close the modal. So I'm going to make use of the square brackets, and then I'm going to say attr, which is a reference for the attribute binding, and I'm going to say data-bs.dismiss, which helps us to dismiss the modal. So I'm going to set it to a condition, but let's define the variable for that condition. So right into our TS file, we can create a variable that says dismiss. This is going to be a signal. I'm going to say equals to signal. I'm not sure we have signal imported into this project, so we need to import signal. And then by default, it's going to be false because it's a boolean. If the user clicks on the delete button, it opens the modal, but when they click on yes and the request is successful, we set it to true. So that's what we're trying to do. So by default, it's false. Then we're going to access it by saying this.dismiss.set, and we're going to set it to true anytime we click on yes and our request is successful. So we can now implement our condition in the HTML file. And to do that, all we need to do is to say if not this.dismiss, don't forget to make use of your parenthesis, is equals to true. We want it to return the modal class, because remember in the data bs-dismiss, it's by default calling this particular modal class. So we want to conditionally render the modal class. If the user clicks on yes and the request is successful, we want the modal to show, else we pass in null. Okay, this should be outside the, okay, we didn't close this properly, so this should be closed here, and the modal should have its own quotes. So I think we now got it properly. So I'm going to save everything we've done so far, and let's try to delete a modal or a particular message rather. So let's delete the last message. This is a form of gibberish, so let's delete it away. I'm going to click on delete. I'm going to select no. First, you can see the modal gets removed, but now let's click on delete again and then click on yes. You can see that message gets removed from the user interface. Let's delete another message. So the modal gets closed and the message gets deleted. So I'm going to delete the messages that don't really make sense. So you can see, finally, let's delete this Latin message. So I'm going to click on delete, click on yes, the modal gets closed, and then the URL only programmatically reloads this section of the user interface. It doesn't reload the entire page. Reloading the entire page includes the browser setting the entire state of the application to the way it is by default, which defeats the purpose of making use of a single page application. So I think we've been able to integrate all the functionality of this chat application. So the final thing I would like to do is to host this application on a platform called Vercel. So to begin the hosting implementation, we need to go to the Vercel website. So right on the Google search, I'm going to search for Vercel and I'm going to try to log into Vercel. To log into Vercel, you need a GitHub account or probably one of the other Git options, version control options like GitLab and Bitbucket. So I have a GitHub account where I already have the app hosted already. As you can see, it's available in a repository called ngchat-v, and then I'm going to continue to GitHub and I'm going to get authenticated into the Vercel dashboard. Now that the authentication is complete, to create a new project inside of Vercel, all you need to do is to click on the add new drop down, then select project. So once you select project, right in your Git, on the left hand side of the dashboard, you're going to see different projects currently hosted on GitHub. So all you need to do is to select the project you want to host. For me, I'm going to select the ngchat-v project. So I'm going to click on import, and then we are going to be presented with the configuration for the hosting of the project. So the first thing we need to fill up is the project name. I'm going to leave it as is currently is, that is with the name ng-chat-v. Then the framework is Angular, obviously. Then the root directory is ./. I'm going to leave that the way it is. Then I'm going to extend the environment variables. Now, you know, in our environment variables, we have some configurations, so I'm going to grab them. The first one is the Supabase URL. So let's grab the Supabase URL, and then the value inside of this Supabase URL. I'm going to paste it here, and I'm going to click on add. Then the second key we need is the Supabase key, so I'm just going to grab that as well, and then I'm going to grab token for the Supabase key. Then I click on add, and those are the two keys we need to add. Before I click on deploy, we can just take a look at the build and output settings. By default, Supabase provides us with these two commands. For Angular, ng-build is the command that helps us to build the project, and the output directory is always located in dist, and the installer would make use of any of these install commands depending on how your project was set up. So if you want to override any of this configuration, all you need to do is just to click on the override, then you'll be able to edit these fields. They are disabled by default. So the way it is just how we want it. So I'm not going to override any of the settings. All I need to do is just to click on deploy, and the deployment configuration begins. So we need to wait for some minutes before the configuration is complete. Now, as you can see, the deployment is complete, and we have a congratulations page currently displaying on the browser, and you can see the landing page currently showing, which says sign up using Google. So what I'm going to do is to click on continue to dashboard, and then we can see the dashboard of our hosted project. So what we can do is just to click on the URL, the deployed URL, which we have here, ngchat-v.vercel.app. Let's click on that, and you can see our project is now hosted live on the browser. So let's try and test this out. Before we proceed, I would like to open the console in case we might have any form of error while trying to access our chat dashboard. So quickly, let's click on sign up using Google, and then I'm going to select one of the existing projects I used in the local version of projects, and we are presented with an error message. The reason for this is our authentication was created making use of Supabase. So we need to configure the Supabase URL, because while creating the project, we made use of the Supabase configuration relied on local host. So it's still trying to access the local host. So we need to configure the URL. To do that, let's head straight to Supabase. And within Supabase, we need to head straight to authentication. And within authentication, let's select URL configuration. So before we proceed, I would like to grab the URL for this project. And to do that, all I need to do is just copy this URL right here and head back to the Supabase dashboard. And I'm going to click on add URL. So I'm going to paste in the URL and click on add URL. Now we've been able to add the URL for our project. Another URL I need to add is the URL that handles the authentication while you are trying to log into the application. So what do I mean by this? Once I click on add URL, I'm going to paste the URL, but this time it's going to be /auth/callback. So this is the callback URL for our authentication. And then finally, right above where we have site URL as localhost 3000, I'm going to paste in our URL there as well, and then click on save. And with that, I think we are good to go. So I'm going to go back and then reload the page. So let's attempt authentication once more. So I'm going to click on sign up using Google button and then select my account. And this time around, you see we are authenticated right into the dashboard, and we have access to all our charts. As you can see, I have my details showing my name, the time of the chart that was sent, the image, as well as the chart as well. Let's also test out the delete functionality. Let's see if this gets deleted. As you can see, it gets deleted. And let's send the message testing live, and then let's click on send. You can see that gets sent as well and saved to the dashboard. We can also log out. So let's try and log out from this project. You can see the logout functionality works. Let's try and sign up using another user, a brand new user, to see how the dashboard looks like. So I'm going to select one of my accounts right here without an image. So I'm going to select continue because this is a brand new account, and then we get navigated into the dashboard. So let's try and send a message with this account. I am a new user, and then click on send. You can see the account name, the account image, and the time as at when the message was sent. So you can see the live version of the project still has all the functionalities working the way they should. So that's it for this project. I believe you've been able to learn a lot. If you are new to the channel, make sure you like and subscribe for more educational content. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.